Hello, I'm Lisa Curtis. I'm director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Welcome to our panel discussion on the Quad equation, how four democracies can uphold the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. The first ever Quad summit was held virtually in March, and we heard from White House Indo-Pacific Coordinator Kurt Campbell during his fireside chat with CNAS CEO Richard Fontaine on Tuesday that the Quad leaders will meet again, this time in person in the early fall. This is exciting news. Holding two leaders-level meetings within a 6-month period shows that the Quad is truly becoming the centerpiece of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. So what can we expect from this emerging group of powerful democracies? Will they develop a coherent agenda and contribute to peace, stability, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific? Well, here to discuss this topic, we have a truly highly distinguished panel. First, we have former Deputy Secretary of State Stephen Biegun. He was confirmed by the Senate for that position with a strong bipartisan vote of 90 votes to 3. And that's quite an accomplishment in this day and age. Secretary Biegun also served for 15 years as corporate vice president with the Ford Motor Company, as national security advisor to former Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, and as deputy national security advisor to Condoleezza Rice. Next, we have Dr. Michael Fullilove, who is executive director of the Lowy Institute. Dr. Fullilove has worked as a lawyer and as a visiting fellow with the Brookings Institute. He is now, and he was previously also advisor to former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating. In 2019, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for significant service in international relations. Next, we have former Indian Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale. He also served as ambassador to China and Germany. He is currently a distinguished professor at Symbiosis International and a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie, India. He has published 2 books, Tiananmen Square and The Long Game. Last but certainly not least, we have Ambassador Shinsuke Sugiyama. He served with distinction as Japan's ambassador to the United States from March 2018 until January of this year. His diplomatic career spans over 40 years, including a stint as Vice Foreign Minister. I met Ambassador Sugiyama at the White House in December 2020 on the very auspicious occasion in which he accepted the Legion of Merit Award on behalf of award recipient, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Ambassador Sugiyama also relayed a story to me that day about throwing the first pitch at a Nationals game in April 2019 and how he had practiced for weeks before doing so. I can only imagine the stress of throwing that pitch in front of thousands of Nats fans. So let's start our discussion. Secretary Biegun, I want to start with you. How did you see the Quad evolving during your time as Deputy Secretary of State? What were some of the pivotal moments, and what were some of the obstacles that you see in the Quad moving forward?
Well, thank you, Lisa, and hello to all of my fellow panelists. It's great to be here with you. The Quad was very much resurrected in the previous administration. Over the last 4 years, a Quad that was largely dormant was reestablished, energized, and formalized into a series of meetings at different levels that culminated in the previous administration with the December 2020 ministerial meeting in Tokyo, which was a very successful meeting and one that I think set the stage for enormous growth in the cooperation within the Quad among its partners in the years ahead. The challenges, of course, were many. There are still issues that I'm sure we'll discuss today upon which the members of the Quad don't entirely align. And those go to very important questions like regularizing, formalizing, and sizing the Quad as well. But also, one cannot rule out one can't ignore the very important influence China in the development of the Quad as well. Well, China was not even a consideration in the start of the quadrilateral security dialogue in the early 2000s. It obviously has become an animating factor that affects all four of the Quad partners, and one that initially actually posed an obstacle. If you think back to 2007, 2008, when there were changes of government in both the United States and in Canberra, in Australia, there was a shift in government thinking that minimized the Quad and actually left it dormant for almost the full 8 years of the Obama administration. It was only resurrected in 2017 at the ASEAN summit among the leaders of the four countries, and that was a absolutely threshold moment, partially, I think, driven by shifting concerns in all four countries regarding the conduct of China in the Indo-Pacific.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to you, Dr. Fullilove. Secretary Biegun mentioned the change in government in 2007 in Australia, and we've seen some recent mudslinging in the Australian press about whether it was the Howard or Rudd government that tanked the Quad back in 2007. But how do you see Australia's approach to the Quad evolving over the past 15 years or so? What has marked some of the turning points for Australia in its attitude toward the Quad, in your opinion?
Well, thank you. And hello also to all my colleagues on the panel. And thank you, Lisa and CNAS and Richard Fontaine, for inviting me to participate. Well, some of you have heard that Australian politics gets a little rough and tumble, and it has over the last 10 years in particular. And even something as sort of niche and esoteric as the quadrilateral security dialogue gets pulled into that. And you're right, Lisa, that there have been dueling op-eds between members of the Howard government and members of the Rudd government as to who was at fault. There's a lot of Jesuitical reasoning that goes into these op-eds. But I think that I would say that the fact that both sides of politics are running away from the decision to allow the Quad to go dormant. The fact that both sides of politics and both leaders from that time are now embarrassed by that decision and they now regret it tells you something. As does the fact that in the aftermath of the first leaders meeting, you had former prime ministers and foreign ministers on both sides of politics claiming credit for the Quad. So I think that gives you an illustration of how quickly and wholly the Australian approach has changed. In 2007, 2008, both the Howard and Rudd government, it was a different era. We were in the lead up to the Beijing Olympics. We felt that we could make hay with China, even though it was run by a Marxist-Leninist party. We could do as much business as we wanted. There would never be consequences. And obviously thinking has changed, and the Australian relationship with China has changed very substantially since then. Now, analysts disagree about exactly why it's changed, but I would say that the main reason Australia's relationship with China has changed is that China has changed. And it's a very different People's Republic that we're dealing with now, much more assertive, much more spiky, much more prickly, prone to, throwing all sorts of economic sanctions against a country that dares to call for a global, independent international investigation into the origins of a pandemic that so far killed 10 million people. You might think that's a sort of a reasonable point to make, but in fact, it's one that has put us well and truly in the freezer. So, look, Australia, I think, had been moving in the direction for a number of years of thickening our connections with like-minded countries. Of course, we've always been very close with the United States, but doing much more with India, doing more with Japan. But really, the worsening of relations between Australia and China in the past couple of years has been quite dramatic. And so it would be very strange if a country like Australia didn't grasp the Quad and see it for what it is, which is an opportunity to develop habits of cooperation with like-minded democracies that have clout. I think it's a real opportunity to build a sort of a positive agenda.
Well, thank you for that history. That's really quite interesting and some really great points made there. I want to come back a little bit later to the economic coercion piece that you mentioned. But first, I would like to turn to Ambassador Gokhale and ask you about India's attitude toward the Quad and how that has evolved over the years. I noticed a recent piece in the Indian press by Raja Mohan argued that India is shedding its anti-colonial, its non-alignment baggage and orienting itself more toward the West to cope with a more aggressive China, and as it seeks to decouple its economy from China's. And I wondered if you agreed with that assessment. And if you do you assess that India's shifting foreign policy orientation will lead it to give the Quad higher priority in its foreign relations?
Thank you, Lisa. Let me pick up from where Secretary Biegun left off. I totally agree with him that Quad was significantly resuscitated as a result of the efforts of the Trump administration. And I would like to particularly emphasize 2 points in this regard. First, from India's perspective, we significantly enhanced relations in those years, not just with the United States, but also with Australia. Japan has been a much longer partner with us for the last 10 or 12 years, since Prime Minister Abe's first term in office. But it is the Trump administration and now the Biden administration and the current government in Australia which has been responsible for a closer relationship with which India feels more comfortable than it did earlier. So that was an important consideration. The second, as you hinted, was a change in the entire foreign policy orientation of the current government in India, Prime Minister Modi's government. Essentially, the maritime dimension has been added by him. And India now looks towards the ocean rather than towards the Himalayan frontiers as its principal area of foreign policy operations. That too brings us closer to a number of countries which have shared interests in the Indian Ocean. Australia, it goes without saying, has it, but also the United States and Japan. So I think these are solid underpinnings to Quad. And undoubtedly, the assertive policy of China has added to that, has given an added reason for four like-minded countries to come together. But I sometimes think that we should not overplay the China factor and ignore the other binding things that hold India, the United States, Japan, and Australia together. Because I believe that's where the foundations have to be laid. And in our perspective, at least, Quad goes well beyond any single country. And it's a concept which four of us share, which four of us have similar views on.
Great. Thank you. That's a wonderful point about it's not just an anti-China or countering China agenda. There's many other things that bind the four countries together and that they can work on. Ambassador Sugiyama, I think, we all have to thank former Prime Minister Abe for his initiative and foresight in understanding the important role that the Quad could play going back to 2007. He was the prime mover on this issue in these early days. He also coined the phrase Indo-Pacific in a speech that he gave in India in 2007. And frankly, since this is now the name of the program that I direct at CNAS, I feel like I have to personally thank former Prime Minister Abe. So are there particular issues that Japan would hope to see the Quad tackle? For instance, Japan has been at the forefront of recognizing the technology challenges that are posed by China, including with regard to 5G networks, as well as the protection of free and flow data across borders. We really have Japan to thank for raising some of these issues early on. So I would like to ask you, what are the most pressing technology issues that the Quad should address?
Well, thank you, Lisa. First of all, I very much would like to express my deep appreciation for how you introduced me, citing the moment when we all three ambassadors representing each of us three, Australia, India, and Japan, including me, to be invited to White House to be given on behalf of our leaders by your former leader, by then National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. And then that was really something that I immediately brought things back to then former Prime Minister. And then immediately after I came back from Washington, after I finished my formal duty as as a Japan's envoy to the States, I was able to see then former Prime Minister Abe, and then he was kind enough to invite me for dinner, and then he was really, really appreciative of your government and your people, praising his efforts and praising the Australian leaders and then Indian leader to join him and join us. He actually showed me the medal in his office, pointing out that that's one of his most privileged medals which he received over the entire political life in the leadership. That said, first let me get back to your question directly. I think these points about technologies and then sensitive technologies like 5Gs or 6Gs or faraway or space or whatever is one of the things which we all faced with jointly. By the way, before getting into further, I think my former Prime Minister's main focus, focal point, is free and open Indo-Pacific region. So by definition, it is not necessarily try to be gang up against one country or trying to contain one country or anything, but try to make it certain that the region is being based upon free navigation and then more connectivity activities freely, and then based upon rules of laws. That's a fundamental sort of an idea which my former Prime Minister tried to raise. So based upon that, I think these particular issues like Huawei's or 5G's or sensitive technology, including semiconductors, networking and supply chains and those sort of things consist of one of the major areas, but not only one area that we have to address upon. But I think by doing that, not alone, each one of us, but by us kind of, if not collectively, but trying to doing in a friendly manner, jointly, and in a cooperative manner, I think the end result is showing is much better. Take an example of something about Huawei thing. I think it was 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago or something, really after I started doing that, my job as an envoy representing Japan to the States. Many people from Japan and from United States and others very much worried that if it were going as such, in 2 years' time from there on, the Huawei and Chinese technology is going to be dominant. Not only us, but also Europe and Asia, Africa, Latin America, and everywhere. But after 3 years or so, or 2 years or so from there on, things become seem to be slightly better. That because of our cooperation, Japan, US, and Australia, being joined by India from time to time, we seem to be, if not trying to beat their certain superiority in the technology stance, but at least we can become competitive against their dominance. I think I'm not trying to deny altogether the Chinese importance of trying to develop their own, technologies. As long as they are doing that in a rule-based way, as long as they are being engaged in an international society, as we are doing. But if they are not, we have to be competitive, try to be against, they are trying to be dominant in the world affairs, in that important field of the sensitive technologies and that sort. And I think by doing that, not necessarily only the court system, court cooperation, but like this, I think we seem to be doing much, much better off. And then court is one of the best examples to show that good end result so far. But we are still in the midst of doing that. We are not completed everything. So what I try to be emphasizing upon is that let's move forward like we have done, as we are doing, and then as we will doing. That's my part of my answers. Thank you.
Great. Very, very well put. And I do want to give the opportunity, of course, other panelists are welcome to join in if they have any other things to add. But in particular on this technology issue, I just want to give the opportunity. Does anybody want to jump in here? Okay. But again, like I said, feel free to jump in if you have any other comments on the technology issue or any other issue that we're discussing. So let me turn to you again, Secretary Biegun. You held a series of meetings with the Quad countries plus South Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand in the months initially following the outbreak of the global pandemic. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what you think these meetings accomplished. And do you think that this way that you held these meetings could serve as a basis for future Quad Plus initiatives? How should the Quad think about engaging other like-minded countries on issues that may, stretch beyond the Quad? I wondered if you could comment on that.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and I will comment on that. But let me just make a comment too on Ambassador Sugiyama's, I think, a very, very pointed and appropriate remarks. The success of the Quad will come from its ability to define itself for what it's in support of rather than what it's against. And I think this has been one of the greatest branding exercises of the 21st century, was to establish the rubric of the Quad would move in support of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And the fact that elicits opposition or concern in some quarters is all the more suggestive of not only its appropriateness, but its purpose. The Quad has a number of positive and proactive areas where the members can work together. Technology has been cited, but pandemic relief and reaction to COVID is obviously one as well. And I was really quite pleased that this was one of the centerpieces of the leader level meeting, the virtual leader level meeting that happened, which illustrates the value of the Quad, not only to the region, but to each other. And also it underscores the positive and constructive nature of this group of like-minded democracies in their pursuit of a common agenda in support of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So to your specific question about the series of coordinating calls that we launched in, I guess it was February of 2020, I have to first concede that it was born of necessity. When the pandemic began to descend upon all of us, but in particular, hitting some of our partners in the Indo-Pacific early on, Japan and South Korea, later spreading even more aggressively here to the United States of America, and tragically to India most recently. We were not only compelled as partners and friends to find methods of cooperation, we had to defend ourselves not only against the spread of a terrible virus, but also recall a particularly aggressive disinformation campaign commenced in February and March and April of 2020 that was remarkable in its intensity and ferocity, and was directed very much at some of the countries in the Quad, as well as some of our European partners. The pandemic spread so quickly that all of our countries were caught with citizens, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of citizens, marooned in every corner of the world on cruise ships, on holidays, on business travel, or just citizens who had expatriated who wanted to urgently return home as an instinctive reaction to such a calamity as a global pandemic. And it was impossible to do this without international coordination. And so the other necessity, of course, that drove this was we were unable to meet in person. I traveled for the first time in 2020. I traveled to Japan and South Korea in late summer, and I was the first visitor, first senior level governmental official in either South Korea or Japan in a 6-month period. That means that my counterparts, the state secretaries or deputy foreign ministers, as well as the ministers, were not meeting with counterparts in person for an entire 6-month period, which is just astonishing. But what we were able to do is sustain on a weekly basis a coordinating call between the countries you mentioned. It was the Quad countries, but we also included New Zealand and Vietnam and South Korea. Now, it was not organized around the concept of the Quad per se. It was organized around the concept of like-minded countries who would cooperate with each other in order to address and coordinate response to the pandemic. And it was extremely successful in doing that. We repatriated our citizens together. We developed patterns of cooperation on sharing desperately needed personal protective equipment at that time. We updated each other on best practices on how to contain the virus. I still remember my calls, the advice from our South Korean counterparts who were so generous with sharing accurate information and data about the spread of the virus, and was the first data we had to go on that we could rely upon because the Chinese had simply refused to share sound information with us early on in the virus's spread. South Korea was ravaged by the virus, but they also accumulated an enormous amount of experience in how to respond to it. All of that was shared with this coalition of Indo-Pacific countries. You know, I am loath to ever acknowledge any silver lining from this terrible pandemic, and the cost to all of our nations has been unacceptably high. But we were able to do something in those weeks. This played out over many, many weeks. A regular call, Thursday evenings here in the US. I would sign on at 9:30 or 10 p.m. We would go for about 45 minutes, and each of my counterparts at the deputy foreign minister level would give an update and where they needed help. That we were able to sustain this was because of the pandemic, because there was no other option, and it was a necessity. So I think that, to take it back to a larger theme, I think that illustrates exactly what we can do in the Quad. It wasn't about an alliance. It wasn't about military activities. It was about like-minded countries responding to the imperative to help each other at a critical moment. And it still remains one of the most satisfying parts of my tenure as deputy.
Well, thank you for that. That was really interesting and just a great example of very tangible, concrete cooperation that can happen among the Quad, but also other countries as well. And let me take this opportunity to thank you, Secretary Biegun, for your service. I think the American people were lucky to have somebody like you in such a senior position at the time of crisis. So thank you for that. Dr. Fullilove, I'd like to turn to you and come back to an issue that you raised briefly in your opening remarks about the economic coercion that Australia has faced in the form of China cutting beef and barley imports after Australia called for an investigation into the origins of the coronavirus. And of course, more recently, President Biden has asked the U.S. intelligence agencies to redouble their efforts to look into this question of the origins of the coronavirus. But how, in your view, might the Quad deal with the issue of Chinese economic coercion? Are there specific policies or actions that the Quad could take to strengthen resilience among the Indo-Pacific nations and make them less susceptible to Chinese economic coercion? Some of the things that have been recommended are maybe a pact among the Quad countries that if they are targeted for Chinese economic coercion, they would either issue a joint statement of condemnation, or they would organize assistance that would be provided to the targeted nation. In your opinion, is there anything that the Quad can collectively do to deter or react to Chinese economic coercion?
Well, thank you very much. Look, I'm not sure that even though Australia is a subject of attempted economic coercion at the moment, I'm not sure actually that the Quad is the right vehicle. I mean, great powers nation states are cold monsters, and the Quad countries have different trade interests from each other. I think probably reforms to the WTO are more likely to be effective than specific policy items at the Quad level. I'm attracted to the idea that Steve and others have said on the call that we have to look at a positive agenda for the Quad that is not just about China, but it's about positive things we can do with each other, and also, as I mentioned before, that developing habits of positive cooperation, making sure that the leaders meet regularly, making sure that they are quick to pick up the phone to each other. So, to me, I'm not quite sure that the Quad has developed to the point where it's the obvious vehicle to deal with what is going to be an increasing problem. Having said that, I think where it is good is in expanding our worldview and in lifting the eyes of the Quad countries and others above the parapet. Solidarity matters. And even if it's solidarity in the form of a statement, that kind of thing helps. So, for example, the comments that Secretary Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan made at Anchorage in their meeting with their Chinese counterparts, that attempts by the United States to coerce an ally like Australia would actually make it difficult for the US-China relationship to improve. I think that sort of statement is useful. So I think statements of solidarity are helping. I think it's all part, as Vijay was talking about, it's all part of us seeing how we can thicken our connections with each other. How can we expand our minds? I think for a long time, a lot of us put all our eggs in one basket. And there were good economic, mathematical reasons to do that. But there's a risk there. And we've all seen the risk, and Australia is feeling the effects of the risk. And so where I would like to see, where I think the Quad can help with these kind of issues is solidarity, but also diversifying our thinking, diversifying the markets we aim for, diversifying the leaders that we pick up the phone to discuss with, creating a shared strategic communities among the countries, encouraging more exchange of information. I think these are ways of building resilience which are appropriate for the Quad at this particular moment in its development.
Great, thank you. Very, very good points about thickening the relationships among each other, and then statements of solidarity when this coercion is practiced. All very good advice. So, Ambassador Gokhale, I'd like to ask you about India has been extremely cautious when the issue of joint military exercises among the Quad countries is raised, or in fact, any kind of defense cooperation among the four nations. Now, some observers assess that Chinese border aggression against China in the spring and summer of 2020 actually prompted India to finally invite Australia to participate in the fall 2020 Malabar exercise. I wondered if you agreed with that assessment, or if you think there are additional factors or circumstances in which India might become more open to Quad military coordination, or even, maritime security type of cooperation or coordination.
Lisa, I would only partly agree with that, because I think that the most important change taking place in India is a mindset change. And therefore, if you look at what has happened in the previous 4 to 5 years, you will find a string of, for example, logistics agreements that we have concluded not only with the United States, where we have done 3 of them, 3 important ones, but with Australia and Japan as well. The cross-servicing agreement with Japan and the mutual legal logistics agreement with Australia. I think that's indicative of a changing mindset, of shedding historical baggage, you might say. Now, I think what Michael said is important, which is trying to evolve something common that we stand for. And I think collaboration in the security field will get strengthened quite a bit if, for instance, we act together in defining what a rules-based order should be in the Indo-Pacific. Frankly speaking, we all talk about it, but there is no rules-based order in a classical sense. The ASEAN Regional Forum and the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting plus are platforms. But beyond that, there's no consensus of what sort of a security mechanism or security system or security rules should be there. And I think the timing is right, because China has made it very clear that it's going to expand its navy to the point where it will have a semi-permanent or permanent presence in the Indian Ocean. The United States is present there. Australia and India are certainly also ramping up their naval presence. So I think 4 countries with similar values and similar commitments trying to define a rules-based order is one way we can persuade India to shed any remaining inhibitions it has. Another way, of course, as Michael said, was trying to see how we can offer an economic alternative. Now, that's easier said than done, because the United States has a different system of helping countries. India has its own system. Japan and Australia, which have done it for much longer than India in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, have their own systems. But I think this is where a bit of consultation can synergize in a way in which we don't really have to dovetail all our rules and regulations. That's going to be well nigh impossible. But at least come together in doing different parts of projects, so that we pool together our resources and see that we deliver on a project, which otherwise individually, besides the United States, none of the others may be able to do. So I'd say that this is important. Now, of course, I don't deny that what happened in 2020 on the northern boundary with India, and the situation still persists until now, has had an impact. Because it has, in a sense, finally woken up the Indian public from the rather naive assumption that what we decided in 1988 as being the modus vivendi between India and China would sort of carry on indefinitely. And therefore, there is a realization that a new modus vivendi is needed. We are dealing with a very different China from the one we dealt with in the 1990s or the early 2000s, and that we need partners to strengthen our own hands as well. So there's no doubt that has played an important role. But I think much bigger is our perception, the perception in India that if our maritime foreign policy is to take off, We need to have a new rules-based order in that region, and that certainly India wants to work with Australia, Japan, the United States, and other like-minded partners. There are others, France, for instance, Indonesia, for instance, and together we can do better than by ourselves. I put it that way, sir.
Great, thank you. No, interesting contrast that you made between the economic coordination and how it would be difficult to align all the rules and regulations among the four countries when it comes to the economic situation, as contrasted with the maritime challenges and how there is a need to come up with sort of a code of conduct to address some of China's naval aggression in different parts, the South and East China Sea. So I think that's an interesting contrast that you made. I would like to now go to some of the audience questions. We actually reached out yesterday to solicit these questions and wanted to give the audience who will be viewing the program a little bit later a chance to chime in. So let's first take a question from Lauren and Sam. They ask, do you see merit in expanding the Quad to include other major Indo-Pacific partners, or to develop side working groups with countries like South Korea or the nations of ASEAN? And the second part of the question is, if the Quad became a Quint, which country would you vote into the Quad? So is there anybody interested in taking this question? I know Secretary Biegun talked a little bit about the Quad Plus meetings that took place after the outbreak of COVID. Does anybody want to expand on this issue of bringing additional members in, or how does the Quad engage with other countries?
Lisa, let me just expand a little bit on this, because we have some experience with this from our efforts earlier in the year, early in 2020, when we put together this coordinating group. The challenge is, where do you stop? Who do you not invite, and how do you avoid a negative effect of appearing to create something that's exclusive and by nature excludes other countries? What we were successful in doing with COVID-19 was aided by where the virus was actually impacting parts of Asia. Vietnam had the chairmanship of ASEAN at the time, so could be representative of ASEAN, and so we were able to very quickly assemble a logical set of countries to cooperate on COVID-19. But if it was a different issue, it might have been a different set of countries. And I can think of any number of circumstances where important voices like Bangladesh or Indonesia would play a very important role in the deliberations of like-minded countries cooperating on imperatives for all of our countries in the Indo-Pacific. These type of groupings, this kind of dynamic engagement across the region, is, I think, the best way to size the Quad. We have four countries at the core of this who've developed a pattern of cooperation, but in different combinations that can be built out. That also has the political benefit of allowing us to avoid the perception of exclusivity, and also of not forcing countries uncomfortably into partnerships in a manner that might be politically challenging for them. I think all of us, I don't care to enumerate them, but we can all imagine what kind of groupings might be more challenging than others, but that won't exclude countries from working together. And so this very concept was discussed in Tokyo among the ministers in December of last year, that different sets of Quad members even would work with different sets of other countries in the Indo-Pacific on areas of mutual interest. And so for now, I think that's the best way to work through the issue of sizing the Quad, rather than try to formalize it and then add members through some criteria. I think that would be counterproductive, and quite frankly, I think it would fail.
Great, thank you. So, Dr. Fullilove, let's go back to you, and if you could comment on this issue of an expanded Quad.
We can see the Quad has some work to do on critical technology challenges in Tokyo, apart from anything else. Look, I really am attracted to the way Steve Biegun addressed this question of expanding the Quad. I actually, on my podcast, the director's chair, I had Admiral Harry Harris last week, and I asked Harry about this, and he had a funny line. He said, the Quad reminds me of a lot of American football college conferences. We have the Big 12 with 10 members and the Big 10 with 14 members. So you don't theoretically have to stick with 4 just because the word Quad sounds good. But the reason I like sticking to the core is this tension in multilateral organizations between representativeness and effectiveness. And the more representative an organization becomes, the less effective it usually becomes. And you can think of the General Assembly, perhaps you can think of meetings of the North Atlantic Council and so on. What I like about the Quad is it's small, as opposed to other organizations like ASEAN and APEC. It's like-minded, and the worldviews are similar to some extent between the 4 Quad countries. And finally, you have four Quad countries with clout. Each of us have in our own way the ability to get the mail through to different extents. The United States, the most powerful country in the world, the top dog, the leading global power, the most powerful military in the world, the largest economy. India, a country of nearly 1.4 billion people that, as Vijay said, is changing its worldview. Japan, I think, is the 3rd largest economy, world technology leader, highly effective self-defense force. Australia is a significant player in its own way, and one that has a long history of providing global security goods. So I think the more that you attract, the more that you buckle or you kind of attach other countries that are not outward looking, that are very focused on the waters or the borders around their own country, or the more that you try to loop in European partners, for example, you hear that from time to time, that they should join the Quad. I think some people got Quad envy after President Biden made the Quad leaders meeting the first multilateral meeting he hoped. But I think we should take it easy, and I think Steve's approach is better. That is, you work with what you have, and you be pragmatic about that, and you develop it slowly with a positive agenda. I think it's important to put strategic muscle and policy muscle on the skeleton, and think of positive ways that we can work together. And then, as Steve says, come up with minilateral arrangements where different groupings of Quad countries work with other like-minded countries that have some effectiveness in cloud as well. I think that's the best approach.
Great, thank you. So we have another question, and this is, many of us know him, Mark Mannion of Congressional Research Services. And I actually first met Mark on my first trip to Japan in 2007. So it's great to hear from him. And his question is directed specifically at Secretary Biegun. He asks, could you talk about the challenges and process of negotiating whether to put out a multilateral joint statement and the negotiating that went into that? Did the Trump administration ask the other 3 Quad countries to release a joint statement at the 2020 Quad Foreign Ministers meeting? If not, why not? And if so, what prevented it from happening? Secretary Biegun?
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Mark, for the question. When the history is written, perhaps sometime decades from now, about the development of the Quad and its patterns of cooperation, its positive agenda, and issues like regularizing, formalizing, sizing, and the mission or the purpose of the grouping. I think the December 2020 ministerial meeting that happened in Tokyo will rate as one of the watershed moments. Secretary Pompeo, there with his Japanese, Australian, and Indian counterparts, still in the midst of a very severe pandemic, I might add, so at some risk to themselves and at some discomfort for themselves, because not only did they have to abide by very strict social distancing and masking requirements. But some of the secretary's counterparts were required to even quarantine upon returning home for an uncomfortable period of time. But all felt that it was important to, at that moment, take the next step in how we were going to proceed in cooperation in the Quad. That meeting, which I was not at, incidentally, so I'm speaking as a third party here. That meeting did produce a robust set of agreements and cooperative ambitions among the four parties, and a decision was made to keep that among the parties. But I think you're already seeing it come to life. Among the things that were agreed were to elevate the meetings of the Quad, regularize the meetings at the leader level, in addition to the ministerial level. And we now have, with the enthusiastic embrace by the Biden administration of what was developed over those 4 years, we see that coming to life. And I give full credit to President Biden for his early action on this, and also for his strong commitment to continue this as in person. The reason it wasn't released is in part because of some of the sensitivities that we've talked about today. There isn't complete alignment among the Quad members on formalizing. There isn't a complete, a single point of view on what the size or membership or participants of the Quad should be. But those are also issues that there's no compelling reason to address. There's something to be said for allowing an organization like this to develop organically. And the regularizing part of it was a very important part. And because that is the fertile soil in which this organic process will continue. And we don't know what the full limits of cooperation will be among the Quad members, and to state it in a published joint statement early on could be more limiting, I think, than empowering. So I actually not sure that we should want the Quad to simply meet as every other international or multilateral organization does and produce these tortured statements at the end, leader statements that oftentimes read more like laundry lists. I think there was a very strong common view of the importance of the Quad. There was a very strong common view of the need to regularize the meetings of the Quad, and there was a mutually agreeable sense of flexibility to allow that process to proceed organically, and it should. The Quad is not a military alliance. It will likely never take on that form. Certainly, it's not an antecedent to developing stationed forces in each other's countries or anything along the lines of what we saw in the Cold War alliances. But we're all watching with concern developments in China. And how China develops will very much have an impact upon the organic development of the Quad as well, and where its areas of priority are. So I like where we are. I don't think there's a necessity for published statements, and the agreements we reached in Tokyo, that the four governments reached in Tokyo, seem to me to be moving along very well, even with the transition of government, which, remember, in 2007, 2008, in a few of our countries actually led to a paralysis in the Quad. Here, we see a smooth transition to a new prime minister in Japan, to a new president in the United States, and I'm confident that the same will happen regardless of the electoral outcomes in Australia and India.
Thank you. We have a couple minutes.
So I'm sorry, because of the malfunction in the Japanese technology, I missed some part of it. But may I get back to you about your question about Taiwan and something related to that?
Yes, please.
You see, yeah, but I try to be as short as possible. Of course, if you try to take a look at the map of Indo-Pacific region, Taiwan is a part of it. And then because of what is going on Xinjiang, Uyghur, and Tibet, and even in Hong Kong, Taiwan question is even more important than ever, because it might relate to our territory of Senkaku Islands. The fact shows that they are invading more than 130 or 40 days, continuously, which is really, really something. But at the same time, Taiwan is really, really important part of this region, but it's not the only part. We do have to see Andaman, Nicobar, Chittagong, Trincomalee, and then Guadal, Salalah, Aden, Djibouti, Mombasa. Taiwan is a part of these sort of thing. Of course, it's one of the most important parts, but this is not the only single important part of the entire region. That's my answer.
Thank you. It's great to have you back in the conversation. I know we're running out of time. We only have a few minutes left. There was a final question, and I think it's a good one to end on. And if everybody could chime in with brief answers, that would be great. And the question is, without hard power backing the soft power issues, is that unlikely to matter much in the competition with China? So I'd like to ask each of you, and I'll start with Ambassador Gokhale, if you want to comment on this issue, or if there's another final word you'd like to say on the topic. Ambassador Gokhale?
I'll come in on this issue, Lisa. I think, as Michael said, each country also has its own capabilities in terms of military and other hard power. That doesn't mean that we have to come together in any sort of a formal way. But I think when we come together as a group, there is the unstated objective that should it be required. There is a much greater capacity for the four countries to come together. So my sense is that the formation of the Quad is not, as the other speaker said, directed against anybody. We should actually form an organization which stands for something and not against something, as Secretary Biegun said. But that doesn't mean that we don't have the wherewithal to stand against something if that threatens the values and interests that all four of us share.
Very well put. Thank you so much. Dr. Fullilove, would you like to give a final comment?
Well, we've also had a critical technology challenge here in Sydney. As you can see, all the lights have gone off. So I'm sorry to appear like the Emperor in Star Wars. It's almost like there are gremlins in the machine, isn't it, Lisa? Look,
the most important thing is we can still hear you.
Yeah, no, look, I'd agree exactly with Vijay. He put it very elegantly. None of us are without capabilities, military capabilities, but that's not the only thing that changes the world. Actually, mindsets change the world, and worldviews. When worldviews change, the world changes. And all of us want to make our way in the world. None of us want to live in the shadow of another large state. We all want to have our sovereignty, our right to make our own way, make our own decisions, and to live in a world in which states are able to make their own decisions. And that's where we can work with friends in the Quad countries to sort of expand our mindset, to realize there are different opportunities, there are diverse opportunities out there, and we can stand in solidarity also with each other. So no, I don't accept that, unless it's an Asian NATO, it's irrelevant. This is not going to be an Asian NATO. It's not going to be a military alliance, but it can expand mindsets in Australia and the United States and India and Japan, and we're seeing other countries see that. They see the power of the example, and I think the power of the example can be very powerful.
Thank you. Extremely thoughtful response. Ambassador Sugiyama, any final thoughts?
Yes. I think my final statement is this. As I told you before, this originated from the idea of free and open Indo-Pacific region. That is naturally meaning that this notion is not exclusive but inclusive. This is not something to exclude anybody, but to not formalize anything. So this is free and open Indo-Pacific region. And this is something which Prime Minister Abe said to Modi at the outset. I remember vividly when Prime Minister Modi and then my former Prime Minister Abe talked with each other, showing the maps between the twos on this region, which includes Taiwan, but as I said, all the other certain places. So this is, I try to be with Indian friend as well as Australian friend and Steve, that this is not something we try to formalize. We try to fix things. We try to make any sort of, standing committee, whatever. But this is some kind of, loose coordination, policy coordination process, which might expand some of the others to come in, which might not. We'll see. But let's try to move forward based upon free and open Indo-Pacific region by us four.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sugiyama. Secretary Biegun, you have the last word.
I just want to thank you very much for an excellent panel and commend CNAS for developing a program directly focused on the Indo-Pacific and on issues like this. The intensity of coverage matches the conviction in the four governments, and I know that that conviction is going to be sustained. There's a sense of opportunity and excitement at the ability of our countries to really align around these issues at this point. There's a lot of work to do. We should try to avoid burying the efforts in ambition, allow it to grow organically. And I think there's a very bright future for free and open Indo-Pacific. With these four countries cooperating, I think anything is possible.
Thank you so much. And I want to give a hearty thanks to all of you. This has really been the most illuminating and thoughtful panel on the Quad that I've heard ever. And thank you all for your quality remarks and contributions. And I also want to thank the audience for staying with us and for joining this conversation. And this does complete the third day of CNAS's annual conference. We'll be regathering to continue the conference next Tuesday, June 15th. And at that time, we'll feature the Pitch 2021, a competition of new ideas. That's at 11 a.m. Eastern time. So I hope you will join us then. And if you have any questions about the schedule, just visit conference.cnas.org for more information. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.